How did you expose your parents who were stealing your college fund? My grandparents left me $400,000 for college when they died, but by the time I turned 17, my parents had spent all but $3,000 of it on their investments. They'd been telling me for years the money was growing in a special account, showing me fake statements they'd photoshopped. I found out the truth accidentally when a bank statement got delivered to our neighbor by mistake. It showed my college account with barely enough for textbooks. Meanwhile, my dad had just bought his third motorcycle, and my mom was planning her fifth cosmetic surgery. But I didn't confront them. Instead, I became their biggest supporter. "Dad, that new investment opportunity you mentioned sounds amazing," I said at dinner. "The one where you need $50,000 by Friday? You should totally do it." His eyes lit up. "You think so? It's risky." "Fortune favors the bold. Maybe you could use my college fund as collateral, since it's just sitting there growing anyway." He actually hugged me. "You're so mature about finances, son." What he didn't know was that the investment opportunity was a sting operation I'd set up with my uncle, who was a federal prosecutor. Every conversation was being recorded. For 3 months, I played the perfect son, encouraged every purchase, every scam, every lie. "Mom, you deserve that new car." Dad worked so hard managing my college fund. I'd watch her preen while charging another $10,000 to credit cards she'd opened in my name. I started leaving college brochures around the house for schools that cost $80,000 a year. "Can't wait to go to Harvard, Dad. Good thing Grandma and Grandpa left me so much money, right?" "Absolutely, son. It's all there waiting for you." I recorded everything on my phone, pretending to make TikToks. The beautiful part was watching them panic as college application deadlines approached. They started fighting constantly, each blaming the other for the missing money. Mom would scream about Dad's motorcycles. Dad would counter with her surgeries. Neither knew I was recording from the hallway. 2 weeks before graduation, I invited them to my college acceptance celebration at a nice restaurant. They showed up beaming, ready to take credit for my success. The private dining room wasn't just family. It was my uncle, 2 FBI agents, and a forensic accountant. "Mom, Dad, I got into Harvard. Time to use that college fund." My mother went pale. "Well, sweetie, about that." "It's all here," I said, sliding a folder across the table. "Every receipt, every forged document, every credit card you opened in my name, every fake statement you showed me." My father stood up to leave, but the FBI agent blocked the door. "The best part?" I continued. "Grandpa was a veteran. Stealing that money is defrauding the U.S. government." My mother immediately pointed at my father. "This was his idea. I have proof." She showed her phone, years of messages where he planned everything. My father's jaw dropped. "You recorded everything?" "Insurance," she hissed. But then my father smiled. "Tell them about the blood test, son." "What blood test?" "The one I took last month. I'm not your biological father. Never was. Which means legally, I never had access to that money. Only your mother did." My mother went white. "Your real father?" He pulled out a photo. "Is the federal judge overseeing this case?" Everyone turned to look at my uncle. The prosecutor, who wasn't my uncle at all, was my biological father. The photo showed him and Mom together, younger, smiling at some restaurant I didn't recognize. Nobody moved. I stared at Julian, the man I'd been calling my uncle for 3 months, the man who'd helped me set up this entire operation. His face had gone white, mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Mom looked like someone had punched her in the stomach, gripping the edge of the table so hard her knuckles turned bone white. The 2 FBI agents, Hank and his partner, exchanged looks that told me they were already calculating how badly this screwed up their case. Dad just sat there with this satisfied smile, like he'd been holding on to this information for years, waiting for exactly the right moment to detonate it. My brain couldn't process what was happening. 3 months of planning, 3 months of recordings, 3 months of working with Julian, trusting him, thinking he was helping me get justice. And the whole time he was my father, my actual biological father, not my uncle, my father, and everyone knew except me. Hank cleared his throat, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. He looked at Julian with this expression that was part sympathy, part anger. He said the case needed immediate reassignment because Julian couldn't oversee anything involving his own son. He used that exact word, son, and hearing it made my stomach twist. Hank explained that months of evidence gathering might be compromised now, that defense attorneys would argue conflict of interest, that everything we'd built could fall apart. I watched Julian's face crumble as Hank talked, watched him realize what his secret had just cost. But I couldn't feel sorry for him. I was still stuck on the fact that everyone in my family apparently knew the truth about who I was except me. Mom knew. Dad knew. Julian obviously knew. How many other people had been walking around with this information while I lived my entire life thinking one man was my father, when actually it was someone completely different? My hands were shaking, so I shoved them under the table where nobody could see. The forensic accountant, Fatima, sat perfectly still with her folder of evidence looking useless now. Mom reached across the table toward me, tears streaming down her face. Her hand was shaking as bad as mine felt. She tried to grab my fingers, but I pulled away fast, pushing my chair back a few inches. I didn't know who to trust anymore. Everyone had lied. Everyone had kept secrets. She started talking through her crying, words tumbling out about how she'd had an affair with Julian before he became a judge. She said she got pregnant, and Dad agreed to raise me as his own in exchange for her family's money to start his business. Her voice kept breaking as she explained, like she thought if she just told me the whole story, I'd understand and forgive her. But all I could think was that my entire existence was some kind of business transaction. Dad got money. Julian got to walk away clean. Mom got to pretend everything was normal. And I got to be the kid nobody bothered to tell the truth. Dad laughed, this bitter sound that didn't match anything funny. He leaned back in his chair, looking more relaxed than anyone else in the room. He said he'd been waiting years to use this information. His voice was calm, almost happy, as he explained how he knew revealing the paternity would destroy any case against him. Julian's involvement tainted everything. All those recordings I'd made, all that evidence I'd gathered, all of it compromised because the prosecutor was my biological father running an operation involving his own kid. Dad looked right at me when he said it, making sure I understood that my revenge plan had just collapsed. Fatima spoke up quietly, her professional voice trying to salvage something from this disaster. She explained that the evidence itself was still valid, but the prosecution would face serious challenges about how it was obtained. She used careful legal language, but I got what she meant. Dad might actually get away with stealing $400,000 because of this paternity bomb. I stood up without saying anything to anyone. My chair scraped loud against the floor. Everyone looked at me, but I couldn't meet any of their eyes. Mom called my name, but I was already walking toward the door. The FBI agent who'd been blocking it earlier stepped aside. I heard Julian say something behind me, his voice desperate, but I didn't stop. I just walked out of that private dining room, through the restaurant where normal people were having normal dinners with their normal families, and out into the cold night air. I started walking with no destination in mind. My phone started buzzing in my pocket almost immediately. I pulled it out enough to see the names flashing on the screen. Julian, Mom, Mark, Julian again. I shoved the phone back in my pocket and kept walking. The cold felt good, sharp and real, cutting through the fog in my head. I walked for 2 hours through neighborhoods I barely recognized. My feet hurt and my face was numb from the wind, but I couldn't stop moving. Every time I thought about going somewhere, I realized I had nowhere to go. I couldn't go home. Mom and Dad would be there eventually, and I couldn't face either of them. I couldn't call Julian because he was part of the problem. I couldn't trust anyone. I ended up outside Mark's apartment building at midnight. My actual uncle, Julian's brother, the one person who'd been exactly who he said he was this whole time. I stood on the sidewalk for 10 minutes trying to decide if I should buzz his apartment. My phone had stopped ringing, but I had 37 missed calls and too many texts to count. Finally, I pressed the button next to his name. He answered immediately, voice scratchy with sleep, and just said to come up. He was waiting at his apartment door when I got off the elevator, wearing sweatpants and an old college shirt. He didn't ask any questions, just stepped aside to let me in. His apartment was small and messy in a comfortable way, dishes in the sink and books everywhere. He went to his kitchen and started making coffee even though it was past midnight. I sat on his couch and stared at his coffee table while the machine gurgled and hissed. He brought 2 mugs over and sat in the chair across from me. We drank coffee in silence for maybe 20 minutes before he finally started talking. He said he'd known about the paternity situation for years, but Julian swore him to secrecy. He used those exact words, swore him to secrecy, like it was some kind of sacred oath. Mark explained that Julian thought keeping it secret would protect me from unnecessary pain. His voice was gentle, but I could hear the guilt underneath. He'd been lying to me too, just by staying quiet. The next morning, Julian showed up at Mark's apartment looking worse than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were red and his normally perfect suit was wrinkled like he'd slept in it. Mark let him in without asking me first, which made me angry until I realized I didn't have the energy to be angry anymore. Julian and I sat on opposite ends of Mark's couch, having the most awkward conversation of my life. He tried to explain the difference between biology and family. He talked about how he'd wanted to be in my life, but Mom and Dad insisted it would be too complicated. He said he'd jumped at the chance to help me with the case because it let him finally do something for me as a father, even if I didn't know that's what he was. His voice kept cracking and I could tell he was trying not to cry. He explained that he'd recused himself from the case immediately after Dad's revelation, reported the conflict of interest to his superiors, filled out all the right paperwork. But the damage to the prosecution was already done. Defense attorneys would spend months arguing that everything was tainted. Even if we won eventually, it would take years instead of months. He looked at me like he wanted me to say something, to tell him I understood or forgave him, but I had nothing to give him. A new prosecutor named Nadia Zamora got assigned to the case 3 days later. Mark arranged for me to meet her at her office downtown. She was younger than Julian, maybe 35, with sharp eyes and an expression that said she didn't have patience for anyone's drama. She told me straight up that she was furious about the mess she'd inherited. Her exact words were that defending against conflict of interest claims would be harder than proving the actual theft. She had Fatima come to the meeting too, and the two of them went through all my evidence piece by piece, trying to figure out what could still be used. Every time they found something that Julian had touched or been involved with, Nadia made a note and moved it to a separate pile. By the end of the meeting, the clean evidence pile was a lot smaller than the compromised pile. Nadia said she'd do her best, but I needed to understand that the case had gotten 10 times harder. She asked me questions about how I'd gathered the recordings, whether Julian had coached me on what to say, whether he'd been present for any of the conversations. I answered honestly, even though every answer seemed to make things worse. 2 days after that meeting, Nadia called to tell me that Mom's lawyer had contacted her trying to negotiate a deal. Mom wanted to testify against Dad in exchange for reduced charges. She had all her documented evidence, those years of messages where Dad planned everything, and she was ready to use it. Nadia said the offer was actually pretty strong from a prosecution standpoint. Mom's testimony combined with her evidence could secure a conviction against Dad, even with the conflict of interest problems. But listening to Nadia explain it, I realized something that made me feel sick. Mom was never planning to protect me. Her insurance wasn't about making sure I got justice. It was about making sure she had an escape plan if everything fell apart. She'd been preparing to throw Dad under the bus and save herself the entire time. All those recordings she kept, all that evidence she gathered, it wasn't because she felt guilty about stealing from me. It was because she was smart enough to know she might need a way out. Dad's parents hired an expensive defense attorney named Conrad Bailey, who immediately started filing motions to suppress evidence based on Julian's conflict of interest. I'd met my grandmother Joyce a few times over the years, but we weren't close. She called me 2 days after Conrad got hired, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She kept apologizing, saying she had no idea her son had stolen from me. She said if she'd known she would have stopped it, would have called the police herself, would have done something. Her voice was shaking and I could tell she meant it. She said Dad had told her and my grandfather that the college fund was fine, that I was doing great, that everything was perfect. She'd believed him because why wouldn't a mother believe her son? Now she was finding out he'd been lying to everyone, stealing from his own kid, and she sounded devastated. She told me she was hiring her own lawyer to see if there was any way to recover the money through civil court, since the criminal case was falling apart. She said she'd do whatever it took to make this right, even if it meant going against her own son. I couldn't stay at the house anymore, not with both of them there pretending everything was normal. Mark picked me up the next morning with 2 suitcases worth of my stuff thrown in the back of his truck. He didn't ask questions when I called him at 6 in the morning, just said he'd be there in 20 minutes. His apartment was small, just a 1-bedroom place near downtown, but he cleared out his office and set up an air mattress for me. The first week was weird, trying to figure out how to live in someone else's space while my entire life fell apart. Mark worked from home most days, so we'd end up eating breakfast together in awkward silence before I'd disappear to my temporary room and stare at college websites I couldn't afford. He finally sat me down on Thursday with a stack of papers and his laptop. Financial aid applications, he explained, showing me the FAFSA form that looked like it required a law degree to understand. The problem hit me immediately when I saw the parent income section. I needed their tax returns, their financial information, signatures from people who'd stolen from me and lied about everything. Mark called the financial aid office at 3 different universities, explaining my situation in vague terms, asking about dependency overrides and special circumstances. Each conversation lasted 30 minutes and ended with him writing down more forms I'd need, more documentation, more proof that my parents were terrible. The applications asked for everything: bank statements and utility bills and proof of separate residence, like I was trying to prove I'd been abused or abandoned. I guess in a way I had been, but it felt wrong checking those boxes and writing essays about family dysfunction just to maybe get enough money for textbooks. Nadia called me 2 weeks after the restaurant disaster while I was sitting in Mark's office pretending to do homework. Her voice sounded tired, frustrated in a way that made my stomach drop before she even started explaining. The DA's office was considering dropping the federal charges entirely because Conrad kept filing motions about prosecutorial misconduct and conflict of interest. Every piece of evidence Julian had touched was now questionable. Every conversation we'd had was potentially coached. Every recording I'd made could be argued as fruit of a poisoned tree. She went through the legal arguments for 20 minutes, explaining why Conrad's motions were so effective, why the DA didn't want to risk a trial they'd probably lose. I sat there listening to my chance at justice disappear because of secrets everyone kept from me. If someone had just told me the truth about Julian from the beginning, if Mom had been honest about the affair, if Dad hadn't saved his paternity bomb for maximum damage, maybe the case would have been clean. Instead, everything was contaminated by lies and hidden relationships, and my parents were going to walk away from stealing $400,000 because the prosecution was too messy to survive. Nadia promised she'd keep fighting, keep trying to salvage what she could, but I could hear in her voice that she didn't think it would work. She apologized 3 times before hanging up, like it was her fault that my family was a disaster. Julian showed up at Mark's place the next evening with takeout from some expensive Italian restaurant downtown. Mark let him in, but gave me a look that said I could tell him to leave if I wanted. I didn't, partly because I was hungry, and partly because I needed answers even if I didn't want to hear them. We sat at Mark's small dining table with pasta. Neither of us really ate, and Julian tried to explain his side of everything. He talked about the affair with Mom, how they'd been young and stupid, and she was already engaged to Dad when she found out she was pregnant. Dad had agreed to raise me as his own in exchange for money from Mom's family to start his business, a transaction that made me feel like property instead of a person. Julian said he'd wanted to be in my life, but Mom and Dad insisted it would be too complicated, that it was better for everyone if I just thought he was my uncle. He'd watched me grow up from a distance, showing up at family events and holidays, pretending to be something he wasn't because that's what everyone agreed was best. When I found out about the stolen money and came to him for help, he saw it as a chance to finally do something for me as a father, even if I didn't know that's what he was. He thought he could help me get justice while keeping the secret, protecting me from complicated truths I didn't need to know. His voice kept breaking when he talked about wanting to be there for me, about all the moments he'd missed because of lies everyone agreed to tell. I listened to all of it, and still couldn't get past the fact that he'd used me for his case while lying about who he was. Every conversation we'd had was built on deception, every piece of legal advice came with hidden motives, every moment of support was contaminated by secrets. He said he was trying to help me, trying to protect me, but it just felt like more manipulation from another adult who thought lying was acceptable if the reasons were good enough. Fatima met me at a coffee shop near campus to talk about civil options, spreading papers across the table between our drinks. The criminal case was falling apart, she explained, but civil court had different rules and lower standards of proof. I could sue both parents for theft and fraud without needing the criminal conviction to succeed. The problem was timing, she said, pulling out a calendar and marking dates. I was still 17 for 3 more weeks, which meant I couldn't file the lawsuit in my own name yet. We'd need to wait until my birthday, then immediately file before they had time to hide more assets or declare bankruptcy. She walked me through what a civil case would look like, the depositions and discovery and eventual trial if we couldn't reach a settlement. It would take months, maybe years, but the evidence was strong, and the burden of proof was lower than criminal court. Civil cases only required preponderance of evidence, 51% certainty instead of beyond reasonable doubt. She showed me examples of similar cases, other kids whose parents had stolen from them, and the outcomes ranged from full restitution to getting nothing because the money was already gone. Fatima was honest about the challenges, how even winning a judgment didn't guarantee I'd ever see the money. My parents could declare bankruptcy, hide assets, drag out enforcement for years. But it was still worth trying, she said, because sometimes partial justice was better than no justice at all. My guidance counselor called me down to her office on Monday with a stack of college brochures and a sympathetic expression that made me want to leave immediately. She'd heard about my family situation through some administrative grapevine and wanted to help me explore realistic options now that Harvard was off the table. State universities, she explained, spreading out pamphlets with smiling students and green campuses. Schools where I could afford tuition with financial aid and student loans, assuming my aid applications got approved despite the parent information nightmare. She pulled up net price calculators on her computer, showing me what I'd actually pay after grants and scholarships at different schools. The numbers were brutal, stark reminders of what my grandparents wanted versus what I was actually getting. They'd left me enough for Harvard, for any school I wanted with money left over. Instead, I was looking at state schools where I'd still need to borrow $40,000 and work part-time just to cover the gap. She helped me fill out applications to 6 different universities, all in state, all affordable in the way that meant crushing debt instead of impossible debt. The acceptance letters started arriving 3 weeks later, thin envelopes with congratulations and financial aid packages that left significant gaps between what they'd give me and what I'd need. I got into all 6 schools and couldn't afford any of them without loans that would take decades to repay. Elizabeth started calling me every few days trying to organize a family mediation session, her voice bright with forced optimism about healing and moving forward. She'd found a mediator who specialized in family conflicts, she said, someone who could help us all sit down and talk through what happened. She kept using words like rift and misunderstanding, like my parents stealing $400,000 was some kind of communication problem we could solve with feeling circles and trust exercises. I told her no the first 3 times she asked, then stopped answering her calls when she wouldn't take the hint. She showed up at Mark's apartment on a Saturday morning with pamphlets about restorative justice and family therapy, talking about how important it was to heal these wounds before they became permanent. I stood in the doorway and told her there was nothing to mediate. This wasn't about forgiveness or moving forward together. It was about people stealing my future and lying about everything for years. She didn't understand that I wasn't interested in family unity or reconciliation, that some things couldn't be fixed with apologies and good intentions. She kept saying everyone makes mistakes, everyone deserves a second chance, like theft and fraud were just unfortunate errors in judgment. I finally told her to stop calling, stop visiting, stop trying to force a happy ending onto a situation that didn't have one. She left looking hurt and confused, like I was the one being unreasonable for not wanting to sit in a room with people who'd stolen from me. My 18th birthday fell on a Tuesday in April, and I spent it at Fatima's office signing papers instead of celebrating. The civil lawsuit was ready to file, dozens of pages documenting every dollar my parents had stolen and every lie they'd told. Fatima had organized everything into categories, motorcycles and surgeries and vacations and gambling losses, a complete record of how they'd spent my future. We filed electronically that morning, then printed physical copies to serve to both parents at the house. Mark drove me there around noon, parking across the street while I walked up the driveway with papers in my hand. Dad answered the door in sweatpants and an old shirt, looking surprised to see me. I handed him the papers and watched his face as he read the first page, watched the surprise turn into something like amusement. He actually smirked when he finished reading, leaning against the doorframe with the lawsuit in his hand. I could tell him I was serious, that this wasn't going away, but he just laughed and said I'd never see a penny because they'd spent it all. There was nothing left to take, he explained, no assets to seize or bank accounts to freeze. They'd burned through $400,000 in less than 5 years and had nothing to show for it except motorcycles they'd already sold and surgeries that couldn't be undone. He told me to enjoy wasting money on lawyers for a case I couldn't win, then closed the door in my face while I was still standing there holding Mom's copy of the papers. I left her papers in the mailbox and walked back to Mark's truck, feeling like I'd accomplished nothing except making everything more official. Nadia called 3 days later to tell me the criminal case was officially dead. The DA had decided not to move forward because Conrad's conflict of interest motions were too strong, the evidence too compromised by Julian's involvement. She apologized for 30 minutes straight, explaining how hard she'd fought to salvage the prosecution, how many different angles she'd tried. But the DA didn't want to risk a trial they'd likely lose, didn't want the embarrassment of a case falling apart in court because of prosecutorial misconduct. Conrad had been too effective at arguing that everything was tainted, that Julian's relationship to me had poisoned the entire investigation from the start. Even Mom's evidence against Dad was questionable now because she'd been working with Julian's son, potentially coached or influenced by the conflict of interest. Nadia said she'd never seen a case unravel, so completely over something that should have been disclosed from the beginning. If Julian had just been honest about being my father, if he'd recused himself immediately instead of running the investigation, maybe they could have built a clean case. Instead, my parents were walking away from stealing $400,000 because of legal technicalities and family secrets. She promised the civil case was different, that Fatima's lawsuit didn't have the same problems, but I could barely hear her through the sound of my chance at justice disappearing. I sat in Mark's apartment that night feeling completely defeated, staring at my laptop screen without seeing anything. My parents had stolen $400,000 my grandparents left me, and they were getting away with it because everyone had lied about everything. Julian showed up around 8 without calling first, let in by Mark, who then disappeared into his bedroom to give us privacy. Julian sat on the couch next to me and tried to offer comfort, talking about how the civil case was still strong and I'd eventually get some justice. I turned to look at him and felt nothing but anger, at him for creating this mess in the first place, at Mom for the affair, at Dad for saving his revelation as a weapon. Julian had tried to be my father and my prosecutor at the same time and ended up being neither effectively. His involvement had destroyed the criminal case and complicated my entire life with truths I wasn't ready to hear. He kept saying he was trying to help, trying to do the right thing, but his version of help had let my parents walk away from felony theft. I told him I needed him to leave, that I couldn't deal with his guilt or his attempts to build a relationship right now. He looked hurt, but nodded and left without arguing, and I went back to staring at my laptop screen and feeling like everything was falling apart. Elizabeth called the next morning to tell me Mom wanted to meet, wanted to explain everything and apologize. I listened to Elizabeth describe how remorseful Mom was, how scared she was about the civil lawsuit, how desperately she wanted a chance to make things right. Elizabeth's voice was pleading, begging me to just hear Mom out, to give her one conversation to explain her side. I told Elizabeth I wasn't ready to hear it, that remorse didn't give me back my college fund or undo years of lies. Mom being scared about the lawsuit was her own fault, consequences of her own choices, not something I needed to fix by offering forgiveness I didn't feel. Elizabeth tried to argue that Mom genuinely regretted everything, that she was working 2 jobs now trying to prepare for the settlement payments she knew were coming. But regret after getting caught wasn't the same as actual remorse, and working to pay back money you stole wasn't noble, it was basic responsibility. I told Elizabeth to tell Mom I'd talk to her when I was ready, which might be never, and hung up before she could argue more. 2 days after hanging up on Elizabeth, I woke up to my phone buzzing with notifications. I opened Facebook and saw Dad had posted a long status about ungrateful children who turn on their families. He wrote about how he raised me for 18 years, gave me everything, and this is how I repay him. The post painted me as some spoiled brat who couldn't appreciate sacrifice. He talked about working hard to provide for his family and how modern kids don't understand loyalty. Within an hour, relatives I barely knew were commenting with heart emojis and supportive messages. Aunt Carolyn wrote that parents deserve respect no matter what. Cousin Derek said something about kids these days being too entitled. Uncle Thomas shared the post to his own timeline with a comment about family values. I sat there in Mark's apartment reading through the comments and feeling my blood pressure rise. These people had no idea what actually happened. They didn't know about the $400,000 my grandparents left me. They didn't know about the fake bank statements or the credit cards opened in my name. They just saw Dad's version where he was the victim of his cruel son. Mark found me staring at my phone with my jaw clenched. He read over my shoulder and shook his head. He told me we needed to set the record straight before Dad's lies became the accepted family narrative. We spent the next 3 hours at his kitchen table writing my response. Mark helped me organize everything clearly without getting too emotional or defensive. I pulled up all the documentation Fatima had compiled, the fake bank statements, the credit card bills, the receipts showing what my parents actually spent the money on. I wrote out exactly what happened, starting with my grandparents leaving me the college fund and ending with the current lawsuit. I explained how my parents told me for years the money was growing in a special account while they spent it on motorcycles and surgeries. I included screenshots of the fake statements they'd shown me compared to the real ones. I listed some of the credit cards they'd opened using my social security number without my knowledge. I didn't mention the paternity situation because that felt too private and complicated to air publicly. But I made absolutely sure everyone understood the theft, the fraud, and the years of lies. Mark read through it twice and made me tone down some of the angry parts. He said the facts were damning enough without me sounding bitter. I posted it around noon with my hands shaking slightly as I hit share. The response was immediate and explosive. Within 20 minutes, Joyce commented that she was ashamed of her son and supported me completely. She wrote that my grandparents would be horrified by what Dad had done and that I deserved every penny of that money for college. Elizabeth commented next, more carefully, saying she wished the family could work this out privately, but she understood why I felt the need to respond. Dad's brother Thomas deleted his supportive comment from Dad's post and wrote on mine that he had no idea the full story. His wife Linda commented that if what I said was true, Dad needed to face consequences. But Dad's sister Carolyn doubled down, commenting that there are always 2 sides to every story, and families should handle problems internally. Her husband Rick agreed, saying I was trying to destroy my father's reputation. Cousin Derek wrote that I seemed pretty comfortable living in Dad's house for 18 years if the situation was so terrible. The comments section turned into a battlefield. Joyce and Thomas argued with Carolyn and Rick. Elizabeth tried to mediate and got attacked from both sides. Friends of my parents who didn't know me commented their support for Dad. Friends of Joyce who remembered my grandparents commented their support for me. Mark's mom commented offering me a place to stay anytime I needed it. By evening, the post had been shared 40 times and had over 200 comments. Half my extended family wasn't speaking to the other half. Group chats were blowing up. People were taking sides based on incomplete information and personal loyalties rather than actual facts. Dad posted a response calling me a liar and saying he had proof I was making everything up. He didn't provide any actual proof, just claimed it existed. Mom stayed completely silent on social media, which I found interesting. The family division was total and brutal, exactly what I'd wanted to avoid, but exactly what Dad had forced by posting his lies first. 2 months crawled by while the civil lawsuit moved through discovery phase. Fatima called me every week with updates on what she was finding in my parents' financial records. She had subpoenaed their bank statements, credit card records, and tax returns going back 10 years. The list of what they'd spent my college fund on made me want to throw my phone across the room every time she sent an update. A vacation to Hawaii that cost $12,000. Dad's 3 motorcycles totaling $38,000. Mom's cosmetic surgeries adding up to $47,000. A boat they bought for $22,000 and sold 6 months later for $9,000, losing $13,000 in the process. Designer clothes and jewelry worth thousands. Gambling losses at the casino that Fatima tracked through credit card statements at over $15,000. Expensive dinners and entertainment, a home renovation they did without actually improving the house value. The documentation went on for pages. Every dollar was tracked, categorized, and time-stamped. Fatima had created spreadsheets showing exactly when money left my account and where it went. She found the fake statements my parents had created and compared them to the real statements showing the account draining month by month. She documented every credit card they'd opened in my name, when they opened them, what they charged, and how they made minimum payments using more of my money. The evidence was overwhelming and enraging. I sat in Mark's apartment reading through the discovery documents and feeling sick. This wasn't just theft. It was systematic, calculated, ongoing fraud that lasted years. They'd planned it, executed it, and covered it up while looking me in the eye and lying about my future. Conrad filed a response to our lawsuit that made me actually laugh out loud at the absurdity. He argued that my parents had implied permission to use the funds for family expenses. He claimed that because they were my legal guardians and the money was in an account they managed, they had discretion over how to spend it. He said I had benefited from their spending through living in a nice house, eating good food, and having a comfortable childhood. Therefore, the money wasn't stolen, but rather invested in my upbringing. Fatima scheduled a call with me the same day to go through Conrad's arguments and explain why they wouldn't work. She pulled up the fake bank statements my parents had shown me over the years. She pointed out that these statements explicitly told me the money was untouched and growing. They didn't say the money was used for family expenses. They didn't say my parents had permission to spend it. They showed a balance of $400,000 earning interest when the real balance was dropping towards zero. That proved fraudulent intent, not implied permission. Fatima also had recordings I'd made where my parents told me directly the money was safe and waiting for college. She had the trust documents my grandparents had created that specified the money was for my education only. She had evidence that my parents lived beyond their means and used my college fund to subsidize their lifestyle, not to provide basic necessities for me. Conrad's argument was creative, but it fell apart under basic scrutiny. The facts were too clear. My parents had lied, stolen, and committed fraud. No amount of legal creativity could change that reality. I started therapy in early March because I was barely sleeping and couldn't focus on anything except anger. Mark had suggested it weeks earlier, but I'd resisted, thinking I could handle everything myself. But the combination of the lawsuit stress, the family drama, and the identity crisis about Julian was crushing me. The therapist's office was in a quiet building near the university. Her name was on a small plaque by the door. I sat in the waiting room feeling stupid for being there, like needing therapy meant I was weak. She called me back, and her office was smaller than I expected, with 2 chairs and a bookshelf and nothing else. We spent the first session just talking about what brought me there. I explained the whole situation from discovering the theft to the current lawsuit. She listened without interrupting and took a few notes. At the end, she said something that stuck with me. She told me my anger was completely justified and appropriate given what had happened. But she also said my elaborate revenge plan involved manipulation and deception that I needed to examine. I'd spent 3 months playing a role, encouraging my parents to incriminate themselves, recording them secretly. That wasn't just gathering evidence. That was me becoming someone I didn't recognize. She asked if I was comfortable with the person I'd become in pursuit of justice. I didn't have a good answer. The question bothered me for days afterward. I'd been so focused on exposing my parents that I hadn't thought about what methods I was willing to use. I'd lied to them just like they'd lied to me. I'd manipulated them into trusting me so I could betray them. Was I really better than them, or had I just found a way to justify doing the same things for different reasons? Julian kept trying to build some kind of relationship with me, but I wasn't ready. He'd call every few days asking to meet for coffee or dinner. He'd text asking how I was doing with the lawsuit and therapy. He offered multiple times to help pay for college so I wouldn't need loans. Every interaction felt awkward and forced. I didn't know how to be around him. He wasn't my uncle anymore, but he wasn't really my father either. He was just this man who happened to be biologically related to me and who'd complicated my entire legal case by lying about our connection. One afternoon, he showed up at Mark's apartment unannounced. Mark let him in and then disappeared into his bedroom to give us privacy. Julian sat on the couch and tried to have a conversation about the future. He talked about wanting to be part of my life and help me through this difficult time. He said he understood I needed space, but he hoped eventually we could build a real father-son relationship. I let him talk for about 10 minutes, and then I told him I needed him to stop. I explained that I was still figuring out who I was without all the lies everyone had told me. I didn't know how to process having a different father than I'd thought. I didn't know how to trust him after he'd hidden the truth while running the investigation. I needed space that wasn't measured in days or weeks, but maybe months or years. Julian looked hurt, but he nodded and said he respected that boundary. He told me to call him if I ever needed anything, and then he left. I felt relieved and guilty at the same time. 3 months into the civil case, Fatima called with news about a settlement offer. Conrad had contacted her, proposing that my parents pay me $80,000 over 10 years if I agreed to drop the lawsuit. I could hear the skepticism in Fatima's voice as she explained the terms. $80,000 spread over 10 years meant $8,000 per year, less than $700 per month. They'd stolen $400,000 and wanted to pay back 1/5 of it in tiny installments across a decade. The offer was insulting. Fatima agreed completely. She said Conrad was testing to see if I was desperate enough to take anything. He was hoping the stress of the lawsuit and my financial situation would make me accept a bad deal just to end the process. Fatima recommended rejecting it immediately and countering with a demand for full repayment plus interest. I told her to reject it without even countering. I wasn't negotiating with people who'd stolen my entire future. If they wanted to settle, they needed to come back with a serious offer that acknowledged what they'd actually done. Fatima said she'd send the rejection that afternoon. She warned me that Conrad would probably try again with a slightly better offer, testing to find my breaking point. She told me to stay strong and remember that we had an incredibly strong case. The evidence was overwhelming. We would win at trial if it came to that. The only question was whether my parents would pay what they owed or force us to chase them through collections for years. The credit card companies started contacting me in late March about the fraudulent accounts my parents had opened. I had to file police reports for each card, explaining that I never authorized the accounts and providing documentation proving my parents had opened them. The process was tedious and frustrating. Each company had different forms and requirements. Each one wanted proof that I was a victim of identity theft, rather than someone trying to dodge debt. I spent hours on the phone with fraud departments, getting transferred between representatives, explaining the same story over and over. Some companies were helpful and immediately closed the accounts and removed the charges. Others were suspicious and wanted more documentation before they'd act. One company actually tried to argue that because my parents were my legal guardians at the time, they had authority to open accounts in my name. I had to get Fatima involved to explain that guardianship doesn't include the right to commit identity theft. The police reports created additional legal problems for my parents beyond the civil lawsuit. Identity theft and credit card fraud were separate crimes from stealing the college fund. The detective who took my report said the DA's office would review them for possible criminal charges. Mom called me for the first time in months after the police contacted her about the credit card fraud investigation. Elizabeth had given her my number. I let the call go to voicemail. She left a message saying she was sorry and scared and asking me to please drop the police reports. I deleted the message without responding. Dad lost his job in early April. I found out through family gossip before Conrad tried to use it as leverage in the lawsuit. Apparently, his employer had done a routine background check after the social media drama and found out about the pending legal issues. They decided they couldn't keep someone facing fraud allegations in a position of financial responsibility. Joyce told me Dad was working construction now, making about half what he'd made before. His income drop meant his ability to repay what he'd stolen was significantly reduced. Conrad filed a motion arguing that my parents couldn't possibly pay back what they owed because they were now financially struggling. He claimed that demanding full repayment would bankrupt them and leave them homeless. He asked the judge to consider their current financial situation when determining damages. Fatima responded with a brief that basically said tough luck. She argued that people who steal money don't get to avoid consequences because spending the stolen money left them broke. My parents had made choices that destroyed their financial stability. Those were their choices and their consequences. The fact that they'd spent everything they stole and now had nothing didn't mean I should suffer. She pointed out that Dad's job loss was a direct result of his own criminal behavior, not something I'd caused. She argued that if the court reduced damages based on my parents' current poverty, it would create incentive for thieves to spend everything quickly and claim they couldn't pay it back. The judge would rule on Conrad's motion at a hearing scheduled for next month. I graduated in June with honors. The ceremony happened on a hot afternoon in the school gym, with folding chairs squeaking and parents crowding the aisles with cameras. Mark sat in the third row holding a bouquet of flowers. Julian was next to him wearing a suit that looked uncomfortable in the heat. Joyce had driven 2 hours to be there and kept dabbing her eyes with tissues. Elizabeth brought her kids who kept asking when it would be over. The principal called my name and I walked across the stage to accept my diploma. People clapped. Mark stood up and cheered loud enough that other families turned to look. But there were 2 empty seats in the row where my parents should have been sitting. I'd sent them the invitation even though I knew they wouldn't come. Some stupid part of me had hoped anyway. Seeing those empty chairs made my chest feel tight, even though I'd prepared myself for it. After the ceremony, Mark hugged me and said my grandparents would have been so proud. Julian shook my hand formally like he wasn't sure if hugging was allowed yet. Joyce cried and told me I looked just like my grandfather in his graduation photos. Elizabeth took pictures and posted them on Facebook with a caption about family supporting family. We went to dinner at an Italian place and everyone tried to act normal and happy. I appreciated them being there, but the whole time I kept thinking about those 2 empty seats. A week later, Elizabeth called to say Mom wanted to meet with me. Her lawyer had reached out about setting up a mediation session with a professional mediator present. Mom wanted to talk and apologize in person. I told Elizabeth absolutely not. She said Mom was really struggling and genuinely wanted to make things right. I said that was great, but sorry doesn't refund a college account. Elizabeth got quiet and then said she understood, but maybe I talked to my therapist about it at our next session. She said mediation might help me process everything even if it didn't change the legal situation. She said hearing my mother apologize and getting to say what I needed to say could be valuable for my healing. I wasn't sure I believed that, but I agreed to one session. The mediation got scheduled for the following Tuesday at a neutral office downtown. The mediation room was small with a round table and uncomfortable chairs. The mediator was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself and explained the ground rules. Mom arrived with her lawyer looking smaller than I remembered. She'd lost weight and her hair was different. She sat across from me and immediately started crying. The mediator asked her to begin. Mom said she was so sorry and she knew sorry wasn't enough. She said Dad had pressured her for years to go along with his plans. She said her own insecurities about aging and appearance had driven the cosmetic surgery spending. She said she'd made terrible choices and destroyed our family. She kept crying and reaching for tissues. Her lawyer sat there taking notes. I listened without saying anything. The mediator asked if I wanted to respond. I said sorry was nice, but it didn't pay for college. I said she'd opened credit cards in my name and lied to my face for years. I said she'd shown me fake bank statements and acted like everything was fine while stealing my future. Mom cried harder and said she knew, and she'd do anything to fix it. I asked if she had $375,000 to give me right now. She went quiet. Her lawyer said they were working on a payment plan. I said that was what the lawsuit was for, and we didn't need mediation to handle legal stuff. The mediator tried to redirect toward emotional reconciliation. I said I wasn't interested in reconciling with someone who'd stolen from me. Mom said she was still my mother. I said she'd stopped being my mother when she chose money over me. We sat in silence for a long time. The mediator suggested we schedule another session. I said no thanks and left. Conrad called Fatima 2 days later with a message from Dad. Dad refused to attend any mediation. He refused to take any responsibility. He wanted Conrad to tell me that I was dead to him. Conrad said Dad felt betrayed by the lawsuit and wanted nothing to do with a son who would sue his own father. Fatima told me this over the phone. She said it in a flat, professional voice like she was reading from notes. I felt something release in my chest. It was almost relief. I'd been holding on to some tiny hope that Dad would apologize or explain or show some kind of regret. Now I knew for sure that wasn't happening. He'd chosen to be bitter and angry instead of honest. That actually made things easier. I could stop hoping for any kind of parental relationship with him. I could stop wondering if maybe he'd come around. I could focus completely on the legal recovery without worrying about family dynamics. Fatima said this was probably better for the case anyway, because it meant no messy emotional complications during trial. I agreed. I told her to proceed with everything as planned. 4 months into the civil case, we were deep in trial preparation. Fatima had boxes of documents spread across her office conference table. Bank statements, receipts, credit card bills, Photoshop statements, text messages, everything. She'd organized it all into categories with color-coded tabs. She walked me through the evidence we'd present and explained how each piece supported our case. She was confident we'd win the judgment. The evidence was too strong for any other outcome, but she warned me that winning and collecting were 2 different things. She said my parents had already started hiding assets. They'd transferred the title on one of the motorcycles to a friend. They'd moved money between accounts. They were preparing to claim poverty. Fatima said they might declare bankruptcy as soon as we got a judgment. She explained that bankruptcy would make collecting much harder and could take years. I asked if that meant I'd never see the money. She said no. It just meant the process would be long and complicated. She said we'd pursue every legal option to collect, but I needed to be realistic about the timeline. We spent 3 hours going over my testimony. She asked me questions the defense would ask. She made me practice answering without getting emotional or defensive. She said the key was staying calm and factual no matter what Conrad tried. I enrolled at the State University in July for fall semester. The financial aid office helped me fill out all the forms. I qualified for maximum federal aid because my parents' income was low and I was independent for tax purposes after everything that happened. I took out student loans for the rest. The veterans organization that my grandparents had been part of gave me a small scholarship, $5,000 toward tuition. It wasn't much, but it helped. The financial aid counselor walked me through the total costs and showed me the payment plan. It was manageable but tight. I'd need to work part-time during school. I'd be taking out about $30,000 in loans per year. It wasn't Harvard, but it was college. I was determined to make it work. The school sent me a housing assignment for the dorms. I got a roommate named Gregory who was studying engineering. I looked up the campus map and figured out where my classes would be. I bought used textbooks online to save money. I made lists of what I needed for the dorm room. Mark helped me shop for basics at Target. It felt good to be planning something forward-looking instead of just dealing with legal problems. Julian called me in early August. He said he wanted to talk about something important. We met for coffee at a place near his office. He looked nervous. He said he'd been thinking a lot about everything that happened and the complications his involvement had caused. He said he wanted to help pay for college as a way of making up for the mess with the case. He said he knew money couldn't fix the relationship problems, but he wanted to support my education. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to refuse because I didn't want to owe him anything. Part of me desperately needed the help. I told him I needed to think about it. He said that was fine and to take my time. I talked to my therapist about it at our next session. She said accepting help didn't mean I was forgiving him or accepting him as my father. She said it was okay to let people support me even if our relationship was complicated. She said I could accept his financial help while still maintaining boundaries about the personal relationship. I called Julian back a week later and said yes. We agreed he'd pay my tuition directly to the school. We agreed this didn't mean we had a traditional father-son relationship yet. It just meant he was supporting my education. He seemed relieved. He said he was glad he could help, and he hoped we could keep building trust over time. The civil trial started on August 23rd. It was scheduled for 3 days in a downtown courthouse. Fatima met me outside on the first morning. She was wearing a navy suit and carrying 2 briefcases full of documents. She went over last-minute instructions while we waited for the courtroom to open. She said to stay calm, answer only what was asked, don't volunteer extra information. Conrad arrived with my parents. Dad was wearing a cheap suit that didn't fit right. Mom was in a plain dress with no makeup. They both looked tired. We didn't make eye contact. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Wood paneling and fluorescent lights. The judge was a woman in her 60s with gray hair pulled back. She introduced herself and explained the trial procedures. Fatima presented our opening statement. She laid out the timeline of the theft, the fake statements, the credit card fraud. She showed the jury photos of the motorcycles and receipts from the cosmetic surgeries. She presented bank records showing the $400,000 going in and the steady withdrawals over 5 years. Conrad's opening statement claimed my parents had used the money for legitimate family expenses with my implied consent. He said I'd benefited from a comfortable lifestyle and was now being vindictive. The judge looked skeptical. The first day was mostly Fatima presenting financial documents and calling the forensic accountant to testify. The accountant walked through every transaction in detail. It took hours. My parents sat at the defense table looking miserable. On the second day, I had to testify. Fatima asked me questions about discovering the theft, the fake statements, my parents' lies. I explained finding the bank statement at the neighbor's house. I described the photoshopped documents they'd shown me. I talked about the credit cards opened in my name. Conrad cross-examined me aggressively. He tried to make it sound like I'd known about the spending all along. He asked why I'd waited so long to confront them. He suggested I'd participated in the family lifestyle willingly. I stayed calm like Fatima taught me. I answered each question directly. The judge stopped Conrad twice for badgering. It was exhausting, but also felt powerful to finally tell the truth in an official setting. Mom testified on the third day. She admitted to everything. She cried through most of her testimony. She said she was weak and made terrible choices. She said Dad had pressured her, but she'd gone along willingly. She said the cosmetic surgeries were her fault and her insecurity. She said she knew it was wrong, but couldn't stop herself. She apologized to me directly from the witness stand. Conrad tried to paint her as a victim of Dad's manipulation. Fatima's cross-examination focused on Mom's active participation in the fraud. Fatima showed texts where Mom had suggested spending ideas. She showed receipts Mom had signed. She proved Mom wasn't just going along, but actively participating. Then Dad testified. His testimony was completely different. He was combative and angry. He claimed he had every right to use the money for family needs. He said I'd lived in the house and eaten the food and used the utilities, so I'd benefited from the spending. He said I was being vindictive and ungrateful. He said the money would have been wasted on college anyway because I wasn't smart enough for a good school. Conrad had to tell him to calm down twice. The judge looked increasingly annoyed. Fatima's cross-examination destroyed him. She showed the fake statements he'd created. She presented evidence of the motorcycles and the boat. She proved he'd deliberately deceived me for years. Dad got angry and started yelling about Julian and the paternity situation. The judge told him that was irrelevant to this case. She warned him about contempt. He shut up but sat there glaring at everyone. The judge took one day to deliberate. Fatima said that was a good sign because it meant she was being thorough. We got called back to the courtroom on Friday afternoon. The judge read her decision from the bench. She found that my parents had committed fraud and theft. She found they deliberately deceived me and stolen funds that were legally mine. She awarded me $375,000 in damages plus interest. She said the evidence was overwhelming and their testimony had been unconvincing. She ordered them to begin payments immediately according to a schedule Fatima would submit. I felt dizzy. It was a huge victory. Everything we'd worked for. Fatima squeezed my shoulder. Across the courtroom, Mom was crying. Dad was staring at the table. But then Fatima leaned over and whispered that this was just the beginning. She said actually collecting this money would take years. She said my parents would appeal and delay and hide assets. She said we'd won the legal battle, but the war was just starting. I nodded. I knew she was right. But sitting there in that courtroom with the judge's decision in my favor felt like something important had happened. Someone official had said my parents were wrong. Someone with authority had validated that what they did was theft. That mattered even if the money took years to collect. Conrad filed the appeal 3 days after the judgment. Fatima called me that afternoon while I was packing boxes for college. She explained the appeal would probably fail, but it bought my parents months to move money around and hide whatever assets they had left. The court process would drag on through fall at minimum. She said this was normal, that people who lose civil cases almost always appeal, but it still felt like getting punched after I'd already won. I asked if there was anything we could do to speed it up. She said no, the system just worked this way, slow and frustrating. The appeal meant no payments would start until it got resolved. I thanked her and hung up feeling exhausted. All that work, all those months of testimony and evidence, and my parents were still finding ways to delay paying me back. Mark drove me to campus on a Saturday in early September. We loaded my stuff into his truck and made the 2-hour drive listening to classic rock. He kept making jokes about college parties and telling me to actually study sometimes. When we got to the dorms, he helped me carry everything up 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken. My room was small, 2 beds and 2 desks crammed into maybe 150 square feet. Mark looked around and laughed. He said at least I'd be too busy to worry about family drama in a space this tiny. We set up my bed and unpacked my clothes into the dresser. He handed me $200 cash and told me to buy textbooks and food. I tried to refuse, but he insisted. Before he left, he hugged me hard and said my grandparents would be proud. I stood in my empty dorm room after he drove away feeling strange. Relief that I was finally here. Anger that my parents had made it so hard. Uncertainty about Julian and what kind of relationship we'd have going forward. My roommate Gregory showed up that evening with his parents and about 15 boxes. He was a normal guy from the suburbs who wanted to major in business. His parents were friendly and asked basic questions about where I was from and what I planned to study. I said I hadn't decided yet and kept things vague. After they left, Gregory and I talked for a while about classes and meal plans and where to get cheap furniture. He asked if I wanted to go to some orientation events that week. I said sure. He seemed easy to get along with, the kind of person who didn't ask too many questions. I decided right then not to tell him about my situation. I wanted to be a regular college student for once, not the kid whose parents stole his college fund. For the next few weeks, I focused on classes and making friends and figuring out campus. I joined a study group for my economics class and started going to the gym. I ate terrible dining hall food and stayed up late talking with people on my floor. It felt good to be building something my grandparents had wanted for me, even if the path here had been awful. Fatima called in early November while I was walking back from class. She said my parents had filed for bankruptcy. I stopped walking and just stood there on the sidewalk while she explained what it meant. The bankruptcy complicated collecting the judgment, but didn't erase it completely. Some debts couldn't be discharged in bankruptcy, like student loans and certain fraud judgments. She was going to argue my case fell into that category because the judge had specifically found willful and malicious conduct. But it meant more legal fees and more delays. I asked how long this would take. She said probably until spring at the earliest. I thanked her and hung up. A group of students walked past laughing about something. I stood there watching them, feeling like I was living in 2 different worlds. One where I was a normal college freshman worried about exams and social plans. Another where I was fighting my own parents in court while they kept finding new ways to avoid paying me back. Julian started texting me in October, asking if I wanted to have dinner. I ignored the first few messages, but eventually agreed to meet him at a restaurant near campus. It was awkward at first. We sat across from each other, not knowing what to say. He asked about classes and my roommate. I gave short answers. Then he started talking about Mom and their relationship years ago. He said he'd been young and stupid and hadn't known she was married at first. When he found out about me, he wanted to be involved, but Mom refused. She said Dad had agreed to raise me, and Julian being around would complicate everything. He said he'd made mistakes and had regrets about not pushing harder to be in my life. He said he hoped we could build something honest going forward. I listened without saying much. Part of me wanted to trust him, but another part remembered how he'd lied about being my uncle for months. We started meeting once a month after that. Slowly, I got used to him. He told me stories about his work and asked about my plans for the future. It wasn't a normal father-son relationship, but it was something. The first letter from Mom arrived in late November. The envelope had her handwriting and a return address I didn't recognize. I almost threw it away, but Gregory was in the room, so I shoved it in my desk drawer. I finally read it a week later. She wrote 3 pages apologizing and trying to explain her choices. She said she'd been insecure and weak and let Dad pressure her into spending the money. She said the cosmetic surgeries were about trying to feel better about herself. She said she knew nothing she wrote would fix what she'd done, but she wanted me to know she was sorry. I read it twice and felt angry all over again. Sorry didn't give me back the $400,000. Sorry didn't undo years of lies. But after a few more weeks, I wrote back. I said I wasn't ready to forgive her, but I was willing to have limited contact. We started exchanging emails every few weeks. She'd tell me about her job and ask about school. I kept my responses short and surface level. We avoided talking about Dad or the lawsuit or anything that actually mattered. Elizabeth called me in December to say Dad was telling everyone I was a spoiled brat who destroyed the family. She said he'd been posting on Facebook about ungrateful children and family betrayal. I told her I didn't care what he said. She asked if I'd consider talking to him to work things out. I said no. There was nothing to work out. He'd stolen my future and lied about it for years, and I was done. Joyce called a few days later and told me to ignore Dad completely. She said she'd written him out of her will for what he'd done. She said she was ashamed of him and proud of me for standing up for myself. Hearing her say that made me feel better. At least some of my family understood what had actually happened. The bankruptcy case dragged on through December and January. Fatima called every few weeks with updates. She filed briefs arguing the fraud judgment couldn't be discharged. Conrad filed responses saying my parents had no assets and couldn't pay anyway. The bankruptcy judge scheduled hearings and delayed decisions. Fatima kept saying we'd win eventually, but it took forever. Finally, in late February, she called with good news. The judge ruled that the fraud judgment couldn't be discharged because it was obtained through willful and malicious conduct. That meant my parents would still owe me the $375,000 even after bankruptcy. But Fatima warned me that collecting it would still be difficult. They had no money now and could claim poverty for years. I'd probably end up getting small payments over decades. It was frustrating, but at least the debt wouldn't disappear. My first semester grades came out in mid-December. I'd made the dean's list with a 3.7 GPA. I stared at the email for a while, feeling proud and sad at the same time. This was what my grandparents had wanted, me succeeding in college, but they should have been here to see it. I called Julian to tell him. He sounded genuinely proud and said he wanted to take me to dinner to celebrate. We went to a nice steakhouse and he kept telling me how well I was doing. It created this weird mix of emotions. Part of me was happy to have a father figure who actually cared about my success. Another part of me was still angry about all the lies and complications he'd caused, but sitting there listening to him be proud of me felt good in a way I hadn't expected. Conrad contacted Fatima in mid-January with a settlement offer. $150,000 paid over 5 years from Mom's inheritance when Joyce died, plus Dad contributing from future earnings. Fatima called to walk me through it. She said it was still less than half what they'd stolen, but it might be the most realistic option. Collecting the full judgment could take decades and cost more in legal fees than I'd ever see. The settlement guaranteed I'd get something substantial within a reasonable time frame. I asked what she recommended. She said to think about it carefully because accepting meant giving up the larger judgment. I told her I needed time to decide. I hung up and lay on my bed staring at the ceiling. Gregory asked if I was okay. I said yeah, just dealing with some family stuff. He nodded and went back to his homework. I spent the next week thinking about whether to take the settlement or keep fighting. I talked to my therapist about the settlement offer 2 days later. She sat across from me in her office with her notebook open and asked me what I was feeling about the $150,000 proposal. I told her it felt like giving up, like letting them win after everything they'd stolen from me. She nodded and waited for me to keep talking. I said my grandparents left me $400,000, and now I was supposed to accept less than half of that and pretend it was okay. She asked me what justice would look like in a perfect world. I said getting back every penny they took, watching them face real consequences, making sure they understood how much they'd hurt me. She wrote something down and then looked up at me. She said sometimes justice is messy and incomplete, and holding out for perfect justice can cost more than it gives back. I sat there staring at the carpet trying to figure out if she was right or just trying to make me feel better about losing. She explained that I was 18 years old with my whole life ahead of me, and spending the next decade fighting legal battles would drain my energy and time. The settlement wasn't perfect, but it guaranteed I'd get substantial money within a reasonable time frame instead of chasing payments for 20 years. I asked if accepting it made me weak. She said no. It made me practical, and there was strength in knowing when to stop fighting and start building. I left her office feeling confused, but also a little lighter, like maybe I didn't have to carry all this anger forever. I called Fatima 3 days later and told her I wanted to counter the settlement offer. She asked what terms I had in mind. I said $200,000 over 7 years with interest, and both my parents had to agree to family therapy if they wanted any contact with me. She was quiet for a second, and then said she'd present it to Conrad. I hung up and texted Mark to tell him what I'd decided. He called me back immediately and said he thought I was making a smart choice. I asked him if he really believed that, or if he was just being supportive. He laughed and said both, that the settlement would let me move forward with my life, instead of staying stuck in legal hell. Julian called that evening and I told him about the counteroffer. He said he was proud of me for thinking about my future instead of just revenge. I told him I wasn't sure if it was the right choice or just the easy one. He said sometimes those are the same thing and that's okay. We talked for 20 minutes about what I'd do with the settlement money and how I'd budget it across my remaining college years. When I hung up, I felt like maybe I was making an adult decision instead of an angry teenager decision. Conrad called Fatima back a week later and accepted the modified settlement terms. Fatima phoned me right away, sounding pleased. She said Conrad had pushed back on the therapy requirement, but ultimately agreed because the alternative was years more litigation that would cost his clients way more than the extra $50,000. I asked when we'd finalize everything. She said the paperwork would take a few weeks, but we should have it done by mid-February. I thanked her for all her work, and she told me she was glad we got a resolution that protected my interests. After I hung up, I sat on my bed feeling strange. Part of me was relieved that the legal fighting would finally end. Another part felt guilty, like I was betraying my grandparents by accepting less than they'd left me. Gregory came back to the room and asked if I was okay. I said yeah, just finished dealing with some family legal stuff. He nodded and didn't ask for details, which I appreciated. I opened my laptop and started looking at my tuition bill for next year, calculating how the settlement payments would cover it. The settlement got finalized on February 18th. Fatima sent me the signed documents as a PDF, and I read through every page even though most of it was legal language I barely understood. The first payment of $15,000 hit my bank account 3 days later. I logged into my banking app and stared at the balance for a while. It was the most money I'd ever had in my account at once, but it also felt wrong somehow. This was money my grandparents had left me 7 years ago, money that should have been growing in an education fund this whole time. Instead, I was getting it back in pieces because my parents had stolen it and spent it on motorcycles and plastic surgery. I transferred the entire $15,000 to my tuition account for next year and watched my fall semester bill drop to almost nothing. It felt good and sad at the same time. I called Joyce to tell her the settlement was done, and she said she was glad I'd be able to stay in the school. She asked how I was handling everything emotionally. I told her honestly that I didn't know, that some days I felt okay, and other days I was still furious. She said that was normal and I shouldn't expect myself to be over it quickly. Mom's lawyer contacted me in early March to set up the first therapy session. I'd almost forgotten that was part of the settlement terms. The lawyer gave me the name of a family counselor who worked with financial abuse and betrayal cases. I Googled her and read her credentials, then called to schedule an appointment. The counselor's name was Dr. Sarah Finley, and her office was 20 minutes from campus. Mom and I had our first session on March 9th. I got there early and sat in the waiting room feeling anxious. Mom arrived right on time looking nervous. We didn't talk to each other while we waited. Dr. Finley called us back and we sat in chairs facing each other with her between us. She explained how therapy would work and asked us each what we hoped to get from the sessions. Mom said she wanted to rebuild our relationship and show me she was sorry. I said I wanted her to take real accountability instead of making excuses. Dr. Finley nodded and said those were both valid goals. The first session was hard. Mom cried a lot and kept saying she was weak and made terrible choices. I sat there feeling angry because sorry didn't give me back the $400,000. Doctor. Finley asked me what I needed to hear from Mom. I said I needed her to admit she chose cosmetic surgery over my education, that she opened credit cards in my name knowing it was fraud, that she lied to my face for years. Mom nodded and said yes, she did all those things and she was ashamed. It didn't make me feel better, but it was something. We kept having sessions every 2 weeks through March and April. Some sessions were frustrating because Mom would slip back into making excuses about Dad pressuring her or her insecurity issues. Doctor. Finley would gently redirect her to focus on her own choices and accountability. Slowly, Mom started getting better at owning what she'd done. In our 6th session, she looked at me and said she'd chosen her vanity over my future, and there was no excuse for that. She said she'd been selfish and weak, and she understood if I never forgave her. I didn't say anything for a while. Then I told her forgiveness wasn't something I could promise, but I was willing to keep trying to understand. Doctor. Finley said that was progress. By the end of April, Mom seemed genuinely committed to making amends. She told me she was working 2 jobs to make the settlement payments, and she'd stopped all cosmetic procedures. She showed me her bank statements to prove she was putting every extra dollar toward what she owed me. I looked at the statements and saw she was barely getting by. Part of me felt satisfied that she was struggling. Another part felt bad about that. Elizabeth called me in late March to talk about Dad. She said he'd refused the therapy requirement and therefore wouldn't have any contact with me. I told her that was his choice and I'd accepted it. She said he was working construction now and living in a small studio apartment. She said he was bitter and angry at everyone, especially me, and spent his time posting angry stuff on Facebook about ungrateful kids. I asked if she thought he'd ever take accountability. She sighed and said probably not, that Dad had always blamed other people for his problems. She said he was telling everyone that Mom had manipulated him into spending my college fund and he was the real victim. I laughed because it was so ridiculous. Elizabeth said she was sorry her brother turned out to be such a terrible father. I told her it wasn't her fault. She asked if I'd consider reaching out to Dad eventually. I said no, that he'd made his choice and I'd made mine. We talked for a few more minutes and then hung up. I felt okay about having no contact with Dad. He'd stolen from me, lied to me, and then tried to use paternity as a weapon. I didn't need that in my life. Finals came in May, and I studied hard to keep my grades up. I'd made the dean's list first semester, and I wanted to do it again. Between studying and therapy sessions and my campus job, I stayed busy enough that I didn't think about my parents too much. The second settlement payment of $15,000 came through in mid-May. I put half toward next year's tuition and half into a savings account for emergencies. The third payment came in early June, right before summer break. I now had $45,000 total from the settlement, which meant I was almost caught up on my college costs for sophomore year. It felt like I was finally getting somewhere. My final grades posted and I'd pulled another 3.7 GPA. I called Julian to tell him and he sounded genuinely proud. He asked if I wanted to have dinner to celebrate the end of freshman year. I said sure, and we met at the same steakhouse we'd gone to in December. Over dinner, he told me he was glad we were building a real relationship. I said I was too, that it was weird and complicated, but also good. He asked if I'd thought about what I wanted to do over the summer. I told him I was staying near campus to work and take a summer class. He nodded and said he'd like to see me regularly if I was open to it. I said I was. We finished dinner and he drove me back to my apartment. Before I got out, he said he was proud of how I'd handled everything this year. I thanked him and went inside, feeling like maybe I actually did have a future. Joyce called me in late June and asked me to come visit her. I drove to her house on a Saturday afternoon. She made lunch and we sat in her kitchen talking about school and my plans for sophomore year. Then she pulled out some papers and slid them across the table. She explained she'd established a new education trust for me with $50,000 from her own savings. The trust was legally structured, so my parents could never access it or make claims against it. She said she was making sure I got what my grandparents had wanted me to have. I stared at the papers, feeling overwhelmed. I asked why she was doing this. She said because her son had failed me, and she wanted to make it right in whatever way she could. She said my grandparents would be heartbroken about what happened, and she was trying to honor their wishes. I got up and hugged her, which surprised both of us. She patted my back and said she was proud of me for succeeding despite everything. I left her house that day feeling like at least some of my family understood what had actually happened and cared about making it better. The trust meant I'd have extra money for my junior and senior years, which took a huge weight off my shoulders. I was walking across campus in early July when I saw a flyer for a support group for students dealing with family financial problems. Something made me stop and take a photo of the flyer. The group met Wednesday evenings in the student center. I showed up to the next meeting feeling nervous. There were 8 other students there, all dealing with different versions of family money issues. Some had parents who refused to help with college costs. Others had family members who'd stolen from them or ruined their credit. The group leader asked if anyone wanted to share their story. I raised my hand and told them about my parents stealing my college fund. I talked about the fake bank statements, the credit cards opened in my name, the legal battle and settlement. Everyone listened quietly. When I finished, 3 other people said they'd gone through similar situations with family theft. We talked for an hour about how to protect yourself financially and how to deal with the emotional damage of family betrayal. After the meeting, the group leader asked if I'd be willing to speak at a campus event about financial literacy and family fraud. I said I'd think about it. Walking back to my apartment that night, I realized that sharing my story had actually helped me process what happened. Maybe talking about it publicly could help other people too. I applied for the summer internship at the Financial Justice Network in early April, and they called me back the same day. The director asked if I could start right after finals ended in May. I said yes without hesitation. The office was in a converted warehouse downtown, and my first day there, I met the other interns and staff who all worked on cases involving family financial abuse. My supervisor assigned me to help families fill out paperwork for fraud claims and small claims court filings. The first case I worked on was a grandmother whose daughter had stolen her Social Security checks for 2 years. Sitting across from her while she cried and told me her story made my chest hurt, but it also made me feel like maybe all the awful stuff with my parents could actually mean something. I spent my days helping people navigate bank disputes, credit fraud, and restitution claims. Every person I helped file paperwork or understand their legal options reminded me that I wasn't alone in what happened. By the end of June, I'd assisted with 23 cases and learned more about consumer protection law than any textbook could teach me. The work was hard and sometimes depressing, but driving home each night I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Julian called me in mid-July and asked if I wanted to take a weekend trip with him. He said he'd been thinking about my grandparents and thought we should visit their graves together. I agreed, feeling nervous but also curious about spending that kind of time with him. We drove 3 hours on a Saturday morning to the Veterans Cemetery where they were buried. Julian stayed back near the car while I walked up to their headstones. I knelt down in the grass and started talking to them like they could hear me. I told them about college, about making the dean's list, about the settlement money slowly coming back. I thanked them for trying to give me a future, even though my parents had stolen most of it. I said I was sorry their gift got wasted, but I was doing my best to make them proud anyway. Julian joined me after about 10 minutes and put his hand on my shoulder. We stood there quietly for a while, and then we drove to a diner for lunch. Over burgers and fries, we talked about building our relationship going forward. He said he wanted to be present in my life, but understood I needed to set the pace. I told him I appreciated his patience, and that slowly learning to trust him felt right. We drove back that evening, and I felt closer to him than I had before. The fourth settlement payment arrived in early August, bringing my total to $60,000. Combined with the money from Joyce's trust, Julian's help with tuition, my student loans, and my campus job, I calculated my costs for sophomore year and realized I could actually manage it. I wasn't going to graduate with massive debt like I'd feared. Registration for fall classes opened, and I signed up for intermediate accounting, business law, and 3 other finance courses. I also got hired for more hours at my campus job in the library. Moving back into the dorms in late August felt different from freshman year. I knew my way around, had friends already, and felt more confident about handling my life. The 5th settlement payment came through right before classes started, pushing my total past $70,000. I put half toward tuition and half into savings. Looking at my account balance and my class schedule, I felt proud of myself for getting this far despite everything. Mom emailed me in September, asking if she could visit for Parents' Weekend in October. I forwarded the email to my therapist, and we discussed it during our next session. She asked how I felt about seeing Mom on campus. I said it made me anxious, but also curious to show her I was doing okay without her help. My therapist suggested setting clear boundaries, like limiting the visit to one day and having a plan to end it if things got uncomfortable. I emailed Mom back and said she could come for Saturday only, no overnight stay. She wrote back immediately saying she understood and would respect whatever boundaries I set. When Parents' Weekend arrived in October, Mom showed up at my dorm at 10 in the morning. We walked around campus and I showed her the library where I worked, the building where most of my classes were, and the dining hall. She asked questions about my courses and my friends. We had lunch at a sandwich shop off campus. The conversation was awkward and surface level, but she didn't make excuses or try to guilt me. She told me she was proud of how well I was doing. Before she left that afternoon, she hugged me and said she was working hard to be someone I could trust again someday. I watched her drive away feeling confused but not angry. I met someone in my business law class in November. We got paired for a group project and started studying together after that. By Thanksgiving break, we were dating. The first time we had dinner alone, I told them about my family situation. I explained the whole thing, from discovering the theft to the legal battles to the settlement. They listened without interrupting, and then said their dad had gambling problems that destroyed their family's finances, so they understood what it felt like when family betrayed you over money. Having someone know my history and not judge me for it felt incredible. We spent most of December together, studying for finals and just hanging out. They met Julian when he came to campus to take me to dinner, and afterward they said he seemed like he was trying hard to be a good father. I agreed. Mark called me right before winter break and asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. I drove to his place and he made pasta and garlic bread. Over dinner, he told me he was proud of how I'd handled everything since the restaurant confrontation. He said my grandparents would be proud too, that I'd taken an impossible situation and found a way through it. I felt tears start and tried to hide them, but Mark noticed and said it was okay to be emotional about it. He'd been the stable family presence through all of this, never judging me, never taking sides, just being there when I needed help. I told him I didn't know what I would have done without him. He said that's what family does, the real kind of family that shows up and stays. I left his place that night feeling grateful for the people who actually cared about me. Spring semester started in January, and I took a financial planning course that required a final project calculating long-term financial goals. For my project, I calculated all the settlement payments I'd receive by graduation. The total would be about $200,000 spread over 7 years. Combined with what Julian was contributing, my loans and my job, I'd graduate with minimal debt and have money left over. It wasn't the $400,000 my grandparents left me, and the path had been so much harder than it should have been, but I was going to get the education they wanted for me. Working on that project made me realize I'd actually made it through the worst part. I was building the future my grandparents had tried to give me, just in a different way than anyone expected. By the time I finished sophomore year in May, I'd pulled another strong GPA and felt settled into college life. I had good relationships with Julian and Mark, limited but honest contact with Mom and a girlfriend who knew my whole story. I'd learned that justice doesn't always look perfect or complete, but sometimes good enough really is good enough. My grandparents gave me an opportunity and my parents tried to steal it, but I was claiming my future anyway. That felt like the real victory, not the money or the legal battles, but the fact that I was still here, still moving forward, still building the life I wanted. I wasn't the same person who set up that confrontation dinner 2 years ago. I'd learned about forgiveness and boundaries, about who deserved second chances and who didn't, about building family from the people who actually showed up. Looking ahead to junior year, I felt ready for whatever came next.